So my name is Anton Gudizwitz. I am a volunteer and leader with Abundant Housing Atlanta. So just for anyone that's joined who's maybe not as familiar, so we are a policy advocacy group in Atlanta. I guess we hear about the whole metro, but I guess a lot of our focus tends to also be on the city of Atlanta. So the whole deal. And so our main mission is that we want Atlanta to be a place that is affordable, a place that has housing that is sustainable, and kind of expanding opportunities for all. And think fundamentally, a strong belief that the reason that Atlanta kind of doesn't live up to a lot of its potential is because we don't have enough of the housing that people need in the places that people want to live. And so we have a lot of advocacy around kind of increasing the supply of housing and increasing opportunity in those ways. So tonight we are joined by Tony Jordan, who is the president and co-founder of Parking Reform Network. And so we're going to be talking a lot about parking reform and parking policy. So within the state of Atlanta, Zoning 2.0, we have a lot of exciting changes coming on in that sphere. Um, and so I kind of wanted to get Tony's going to kind of lay out I guess a high level or explanation of kind of why zoning reform is important. Um, and kind of I'll take over after that for a little bit, just talking about specifically what's coming in zoning 2.0. And then we'll be able to kind of open up for some questions and any kind of discussion that comes from that. Um, but otherwise, I guess, Tony, you want to take it away?
Hello. Hey, everybody. Thanks a lot for the introduction. As mentioned, Tony Jordan. I'm president of the Parking Reform Network. I live in Portland, Oregon. And I'm going to talk to you about, how parking is driving up housing costs and in general, parking problems. I think that this is when you're thinking about parking and advocating for reforms that impact housing, it's especially helpful to think of this in a holistic way. There's a lot of other things that parking impacts, and it strengthens your overall argument to address them too. Um, the Parking Reform Network is a C3 organization, 501(c)(3) organization with national scope. We have international members. And we work to educate the public about the impact of parking policy and work with partners like Abundant Housing Atlanta to accelerate adoption of reforms. And we do this through events like this, one-on-one meetings, publishing materials and maps, some of which we'll show a little bit here. So I'm going to talk to you about the parking problem. And if you ask your average person, what's the problem with parking, they're probably going to tell you that it is there's not enough parking and it costs too much. And what I'm here to say is that's exactly the opposite of how probably we should think about it. There is too much parking in the United States in general, and it is generally unmanaged and seems free. We know it's not free though. It's bundled into the cost of office space, housing. We pay for it in time. We pay for it in pollution, all sorts of other things. But so part of winning this argument and making the argument is kind of flipping the script and showing people what actually is the problem with parking. The original sin kind of and the problem that we're starting here with is parking mandates. Parking mandates, sometimes called parking requirements, minimum parking requirements, are little bits in your zoning code, which I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with, that are they say for every land use and for every type of building you want to build, you have to provide a certain amount of parking. And these have been in our zoning codes for a long time. And the result has been that downtowns. I should have put Atlanta on here. I can't remember what it is. Probably around 20 something percent. I'm guessing, but because of the application of parking mandates in all of our cities in the United States, when you survey cities like we have, large parts of our central cities and are made up of parking, 20 to 30%, kind of on average around the United States. That's the central city. It's even worse when you look outside of central cities to newer built uh, areas, commercial centers. There's often probably 40, 50% parking. We actually don't have the data directly on that, but you can look at satellite image and kind of just guess. So we've got a lot of parking. it got here and these mandates. So a lot of people want to know how we like where these numbers come from. And I'm going to spend a chunk of time here kind of just driving home heavily, hopefully and humorously, the point that they are ridiculous. That this is from 1954, back in the 40s and 50s when they were just when people were building things post-war. The planner and the architect would get together and decide how much parking they needed at a shopping center. And this person said, there's not a correct answer. We would just guess a number of stalls, and invariably there's either too many or not enough. And I think that's a key point, which is as I show you these numbers, just think the at best, it's going to be impossible to ever know for exactly how much parking there is. And that's part of our argument is that the state shouldn't be requiring it. To demonstrate this very clearly, I'm going to show you a couple slides with parking requirements just from this area in Connecticut, the capital region of Connecticut. It's like a 30 by 30 square. There's about 20 to 30 different jurisdictions in here. And in preparation for a presentation a couple months back, I looked at the zoning code of all of these cities and I compiled some information, a case study as if I was going to open a bowling alley in Connecticut. So if I was going to open a bowling alley in Ellington, Connecticut, I would need to provide two parking spaces per lane or alley. Alley, lane are interchangeable here. And in West Hartford, Connecticut, I would need eight per alley. And you might think that's kind of strange. Why would I need four times as much parking in West Hartford as I would in Ellington? I've considered this a lot. Is it a carpooling thing or just a personal preference? I think it's ridiculous. But then the really ridiculous thing is that I found every single other number in between just in that 30 by 30 mile square, two through eight per lane or alley. So I show this to folks and I stress it's useful. And I'll show a couple examples that are more local to you, or at least one, but it's worth it to like really recognize how arbitrary these numbers are. Funeral homes, same kind of thing, right? 5 per chapel to 40 per chapel. That's an 8 times difference between the lowest parking requirement of 5 spaces per chapel and the largest one here, 40. If by chapel isn't your thing, I got the same 8 times spread here from Mansfield to Weathersfield, one per 25 square feet and one per 200. I'll show you a graphic, but recognizing that one per 25 square feet means, a parking space is 300 to 400 square feet. So the parking lot for a funeral home in Weathersfield is going to be 12 to 16 times bigger than the facility itself. For a local example, I did, when I gave a talk a couple months ago or about a year and a half ago at College Park, Roswell, Georgia, 2 per lane. Union City, Georgia, and in the few places where there are commercial mandates in Atlanta, roughly 10 per lane, 1 per 100 square feet. It's not everything in between, but you got 4, 5, 7, 8. College Park has 7 and 8 per lane. So it's completely arbitrary, not made up. I have a few more of these because I can't stop. Gilbert, Arizona, haunted house. I don't want to just make fun of Georgia or Connecticut. Carver, Massachusetts, a cemetery, 1 per 8 occupants. This tiny place in Georgia, actually Woodbury, very small, mostly a cemetery from the satellite imagery. Apologies if anyone is from there. This place has a zoning code with 2 different parking requirements for helicopter land uses with both separate parking requirements for heliport and helistop. What's the difference? Hell if I know. That's my main dad joke for the presentation. So this is funny, but it's not a laughing matter. The parking requirements are the DNA of your city. How they express themselves leads to places that are easy to get to, but not where you want to be. I mean, easy to get to by car, I should add. Not necessarily where you want to be. They're sprawly, they're hot, they're unpleasant, and this is a problem. So parking mandates, hopefully you understand, pretty arbitrary and bad. But it's even worse than that because parking costs a lot of money, right? A parking space costs between, for a surface space, $5,000 to $10,000 per stall. An above ground parking space like you might have in a modern apartment building is in the mid 10,000s. So, 40, 50, $60,000 a stall. And if a lot of people think, well, why don't we just build it below that? You're going to double the cost of the above ground stall if you go below ground, roughly. Just to add, people will often ask for like specifics of these things, and you're never going to find it like really the sky is the limit. You can spend as much as possible on parking, but the best thing is if you want to make the argument, go find a recent building, ask someone, find a public garage that was built and just divide the number of stalls by how much the project cost. A parking, this is useful for all sorts of housing discourse, but $1,000 in construction means $10 in rent. So if you have a $40,000 parking space, someone has to pay $400 a month in rent. If it's not bundled, if the parking isn't directly bundled into the cost of housing, you're maybe a $40,000 stall. If they're even charging $200 a month for rent, $200 is still being charged to every person in the building or every household for every stall, whether they're driving or not. This is real stuff. Like we talk about often budgets being moral documents. A in Stamford, Connecticut, I found this example of a parking garage that's built by the train station that is about 1,000 parking spaces and it costs $90 million. So $88,000 for a banker to still drive part of the way to work, maybe a banker, and park in this garage. In the same city, a permanently deeply affordable housing complex called the Franklin Apartments, which houses between 100 and 120 people, depending on how many per household. $77,000 per person, right? So like this was built with $9 million of investment. It requires no ongoing subsidy to be permanently affordable. So we can, in many places in this country, house people for less than it literally costs to park a car. A local example where you can see how this affects the cost. When I was down in College Park, there's these Ion Arts apartments that I was shown, and we looked up how much they were cost. They're condos, and I looked at these two listings, and this is from a year and a half ago, so I can't guarantee it's the same. But these are basically the same condo unit. One is on the third floor and one is on the second floor. But the real difference between these two listings is that the one that cost $31,000 less didn't have a dedicated parking space. So you might often get the question, how do we know that this is going to cost? How do we know it's going to save money? The landlords are just going to, jack up the price anyway. If you're buying or renting an apartment and you can choose between one that has a dedicated parking space and one that doesn't, no one in their right mind is going to pay the same price for that. And that's reflected in the cost. Parking costs, parking takes up a ton of space too, right? So in many cities, and I'm not exactly sure, I didn't dig this up, I should have looked, but it's pretty common for housing, multifamily housing, to have a parking requirement of 1.5 to 2 parking spaces per unit. Sometimes that's based on bedroom, but as I mentioned before, a parking space takes up 300 to 400 square feet when you include the access ways. So, a 1.5 to 2 parking space requirement per apartment means you're requiring, 450 to 600 or 450 to 800 square feet, per unit to be for parking, which is, often, I mean, we looked at those condos we looked at from the Ion Arts. These were 500 square foot condos, pretty small, but I mean, so like, if you had 2 parking spaces there, you're requiring more space for the parking than for the condo itself. This is really clear when you think about those parking requirements in comparison to how many renter households have multiple vehicles in and this is not I do this all over the place. I mean, Atlanta and other big cities, it's pretty striking when you look at the census data and you see that 76% of renter households in Atlanta only have one vehicle or no vehicle. And if you're requiring 1.5 to 2 parking spaces per unit, then like a single parent who doesn't want to sleep in the same bedroom as their kid is probably, or in the same studio apartment as their kid, is probably paying a parking tax. You can stretch this out to the Atlanta metro, and it's not as major, but still 62% of households, according to the census data, have access to one vehicle or no vehicle. So, particularly in multifamily, these parking requirements for housing don't make sense. It's important, I think, to address that, the people who are not owning vehicles and aren't driving and who are paying these additional parking fees or might choose housing or prefer housing that doesn't have the cost of additional parking in it, are everywhere. This is a fantastic book by Anna Zivarts. And it really talks about how a lot of the non-drivers are, they are people with disabilities. They are people with medical conditions. They're children, they're old people. They are people with criminal records who can't drive for that reason, or just people who don't feel comfortable driving all over the place. And you'll hear a common argument as you're pushing for housing and zoning reforms of this neighborhood is not, this isn't walkable enough, or this isn't close enough to services, or this is not a place where we should have people. And I think it's critical to know that no matter what how hostile the neighborhood is to pedestrians, there are people almost certainly living in that neighborhood right now who can't drive, and they're dealing, they're paying a tax, or they can't find a house anywhere. I mean, let alone somewhere that's more walkable without paying for parking that they're not using. Um, so when we think about this cost and the space together, this is a slide that just kind of drives home when you look at how those parking requirements, how they lead to the different topology and the walkability and the scale of things, right? A no parking required zoning code would allow for, the architect and the developer to determine whether they want to use the whole lot or not. The more parking you're requiring on a lot, it seems pretty basic, but I think the general public doesn't always know this. The more pavement you're going to have and the fewer buildings you're going to have. This expresses itself pretty clearly when you look at images. All these images I'm going to show you like this with these squares are side by side the same area, right? So this is Bentonville, Arkansas, right, where the entire downtown compared to a nearby area near Bentonville that has been built, post-war ostensibly or apparently, where just you can just clearly see the accessibility and the density and the number of options in the one on the right are not comparable. A more local example, College Park, where I have these slides because I did these presentations. You have this stretch that's from the kind of the older part of College Park where there's a number of businesses in a row, and some housing right behind it, versus a couple blocks away, some developments that are more modern, where really it's mostly parking. It's hostile to walking on the sidewalk. You have less housing nearby available. So these aren't, people are driving to these facilities. It's pretty clear, but, pulling up these examples can be pretty useful. There's a lot of other reasons to, you have environmental reasons to oppose parking requirements, stormwater. I often will go deeper into those, and we can in Q&A. But I think, the last one I want to really address is when we think about those pictures of human scale versus automobile scale, the impact on your traffic. Because one of the arguments everyone hears from anti-housing folks is, it's going to cause more traffic. And the key here is it's the parking that feeds more traffic, right? You have more parking, that's going to invite more cars, bigger roads, more sprawl. Other modes don't work as well. So people are more car dependent. They demand more cars, which needs more parking. And this is the one more lane, bro meme here. Fortunately, there are some great solutions here. Three in particular from Professor Donald Shoup, who passed away just about a year ago at UCLA, spent most of his career talking about three steps to make better cities. Eliminate costly parking mandates. When necessary, price curbs in cities so that you have access and availability. This is more for commercial areas, but by 85% occupancy. And where you do need to charge for parking, reinvest the money to improve the neighborhood. I often will just say to reduce car dependency because it leads to a nice feedback loop. Cities across the country are getting rid of their parking mandates. This is happening. And so, the wind is at your back in Atlanta for this part of your housing policy, or should be. When we started PRN in 2020, there were 18 North American cities that had gotten rid of parking mandates entirely. This is not just for residential and commercial citywide. As of maybe a week ago, we'd identify at least 107. And there are statewide reforms that are on the way. North Carolina is considering a full repeal on parking mandates for the whole state, both commercial, residential. Connecticut passed basically a residential parking requirement repeal last year 2 times because one time it got vetoed. So this is happening. And when you do this, I want to just point that one thing is this is a little bit kind of like what happens. Maybe I should have had this slides out of place, but I do just want to point out you can do a lot more in the same space, right? This is a key thing when you're talking about it's choice. There's often an argument that these reforms, both just general YIMBY reforms and housing reforms, but also transportation reforms, are trying to social engineer or push people into things. And I think that argument that should be effective is to talk about choices, right? just what you can do in that same space, whether it be housing or in this case, restaurants. These are two side-by-side images from Fayetteville, Arkansas that got rid of their commercial parking requirements years ago. On the right is the downtown of Fayetteville, which is full of restaurants, many of which opened after the city got rid of its commercial parking requirements because it allowed for adaptive reuse of buildings that previously would not have allowed more restaurants to open or intensive uses. And on the left is a couple miles away from Fayetteville, an Olive Garden and a hibachi restaurant. And I think that, the options you have, even as expansive as the Olive Garden menu might be, they don't hold a candle to having a bunch of smaller options or more flexible options. And so I think a key here is these zoning reforms, changing minimum lot sizes, changing, parking requirements, they allow for a greater variety of options for everyone. So your other argument you're going to have generally when you're trying to build more housing or reduce parking requirements is that it's going to cause congestion on the street, that there's going to be too many people parking in the neighborhood. And my answer to this is that, and our answer of PRN is kind of cities should mind their own business when it comes to parking. They should not be telling developers, landlords, entrepreneurs, consumers, tenants, how much parking they need to procure or pay for. They should mind their business, which is the property they own, maybe the biggest asset that the city often owns, which is the curb space, and manage that. And then that will send proper signals and incentivize and encourage and basically require smart choices to be made by people building or moving into buildings. The key here is parking management, which is mostly meters and permits. The key policy here is city watches how much congestion there is on curbs, and if there is low utilization of parking, I mean, and by that I mean if there are a lot of spaces available on the curb, then the price maybe is low or free because the curb is not worth charging for. But as you reach a point where more people are parking there, you use meters and permits to uh, to manage that parking by price. This is great. It's fair because you're trying to charge the lowest price that leads to availability, and availability is access, right? This is a thing. It's agency and access. If I want to park in a convenient spot in front of a business where I'm going and I'm willing to pay, I can choose that choice, or maybe I am cost sensitive and I can park a little farther away. The worst case scenario here is when we charge for parking and we charge too low of a price. So I circle around looking for a space. I still waste my time and I pay something, but not enough. So we want to get that price right. This is a data-driven and responsive policy, so it's not political ideally. And for businesses or people who are worried about businesses or access, the pricing increases the turnover and access. You get more customers, or your visitors to your place ideally have a better experience, even though it does cost a little bit. The key here is you want to spend this money wisely. You don't want to dump it down a black hole into the general fund where people don't see a benefit from it. There's a concept called parking benefit districts. You spend the money on things like sidewalks and crosswalks, better lighting. You can buy transit passes for residents. In Portland, we have a golden transportation wallet program that gives a suite of transportation benefits to people in affordable housing projects. You can build bike lanes and bus shelters. We have a whole resource here about parking benefit districts. It's like a guidebook for this. So I will often recommend that you introduce, um, you know, encourage your city to at least adopt or move towards adopting policies that are better curb management at the same time they do zoning reforms. They don't necessarily have to implement them hand in hand, but I got my start in Portland partly because we had done zoning reforms and not on-street parking reforms, and eventually there was a big blowback to some of the parking reforms because there was no on-street management. So you want to try to get ahead of the game. What happens when you do this? When you get rid of your parking requirements and these other policies? Well, first, nothing, right? The city exists as it does today, right? If you got rid of all the remaining parking requirements in Atlanta, well, all the parking that currently exists in Atlanta, which is, I'm sure, quite a bit, is still there, and it's going to be there for a while. People who have parking spaces at their home or apartment still have them, and they can still drive to shopping centers with large parking lots, right? So once again, what's going to happen is for most people, nothing, but you're going to get the possibility of a little more of what you want and a bit less of what maybe you don't. I mean, this is subjective, but when we looked at this in other cities, the majority of new homes permitted after eliminating parking mandates would have been illegal under the prior code. This means that for any particular building, it would not have been able to be permitted. The majority of buildings after you do reforms take advantage of the reform, I guess, is the gist here. But they still build parking voluntarily. So what you often see as incremental or marginal improvements. A building that might have had 50 units in it, 50 homes in it, and maybe it even had 50 parking spaces. Well, maybe what they're going to build afterwards is 60 homes with 50 parking spaces or 75 homes with 50 parking spaces. So you're going to get more homes. You're probably still going to get some parking in most cases. And those homes, those marginal homes are going to be, contribute greatly to affordability because the building, adding one or two or 10 units onto a building costs a lot less than building another building nearby with 10 units in it. This is parking reform is one of the keys to missing middle housing and other similar reforms. In Seattle, when they had ADUs legalized, it kind of, just petered along until they got rid of parking mandates, and then there was a skyrocketing in use. This makes total sense if you think about how missing middle housing is applied. If you're requiring parking spaces, you're just not going to fit things on there. I know Kronberg and Associates, Eric Kronberg in Atlanta has some great slides. If you've ever seen one of his presentation that really drive this home, I can recommend that. We can provide more access and abundance, and this is a kind of two-piece thing. I want to talk about how you get one of the big arguments around we can't do this right now is we don't have good enough transit or there's not enough XYZ. And I think that there's a mode of providing access, which is point A to point. I live here and I work here, or I live here and I shop here. I live here, I go to school here at different parts of the city. And so that mode does require transit or vehicles or some sort of safe passage across the city. We're seeing a lot of center and corridor infill. So there's two other ways to provide this access and abundance. One is to provide more homes in areas where there is commercial and employment and other activities, right? And so we see that this is a center and corridor infill. We're going to upzone and allow more taller and bigger buildings on top of commercial or near other uses. A little less, and one thing that I think is particularly useful when you think about your Atlanta metro region as a whole, and maybe even neighborhoods in a place like Atlanta, is suburban infill and retrofit, allowing more businesses and employment opportunities to be put into areas where there are mostly residences currently. And I guess suburban infill and retrofit can also be, I'll talk about another example too about mall restoration or shopping center. But the idea that there are more than one way to do this, and I think our best example is to try and do as many of these all at once, and let things be a little messy and let people figure things out. A special pitch here for accessory commercial units, ACUs, which are the types of businesses we used to see in residential neighborhoods. These could be coffee shops, they could be hair salons, they could be bike repair, all sorts of things. You don't see this anymore because it's mostly illegal, but the corner store type model is a really great way to reduce traffic and trips and increase access and make places just more walkable. A personal example here is my grandmother had a salon in her basement in East Chicago, Indiana, back in the 50s when she was raising my dad and his two brothers. This helped her make ends meet after my grandfather left. If she were to do this in Palmetto, Georgia, she would need 3 parking spaces for that one station, and she certainly wouldn't be able to do it, even if it was legal, which it's not in a lot of the country. The other last I'm going to end on, or last example of this is this kind of idea of what we can do with the space we have now once we make these reforms. So this is in Rogers, Arkansas. Big lots equal big opportunities. These places are about 2 miles down the road. It's the same space, a chunk of much of downtown Rogers, Arkansas, which has no parking requirements anymore, fits into just part of the parking lot of a nearby shopping mall, which is mostly empty. There are examples of people doing this. There's this guy, Monty Anderson, um, electric housing and options real estate, working in a number of in Texas and Indiana on taking shopping centers and kind of replatting them, breaking up the big boxes for commercial real estate, adding townhomes or other kind of main street ideas. So there's a lot you can do once you head down the road of making your of relaxing your zoning codes, basically. And just as an example, I gave a talk a couple years ago in Gwinnett County, right? I mean, obviously they're thinking of doing this in the Gwinnett Place Mall, which I walked around entirely in the shop in the parking lot. You know, I'm going to say like this is obviously a major redevelopment opportunity. One criticism I have of like the plans of this is that they require this to be it's such a project to redevelop a big spot like this, and they absolutely should. But there are a lot of smaller places like these smaller shopping centers that can be redeveloped all over our cities today with much less capital investment. So we should be doing both of them. I'm going to end on just hammering home a couple things that you can still do if you get rid of your parking requirements and increase your density. You can still restrict parking on public streets. You can still set time limits for parking. You can still charge for on-street parking. You can still require permits. You can require ADA accessibility. You can require accommodations for loading and drop-off. So when all of the transportation concerns, there are better solutions to parking requirements to solve those problems than the parking requirements themselves. This is almost just axiomatic in that if the parking requirements solved any problems with traffic or transportation, we wouldn't have those problems because we've had parking requirements for the last 80 years. So that's my talk, and I'm happy to answer questions and after we hear about what's going on in Atlanta.
Thank you. Yes, I guess I'll go ahead and talk about Atlanta specifically, and then we'll kind of to get to questions for either myself or Tony here. Share. Let me see in here. All right. So I guess zoning 2.0. So first of all, just want to go ahead. So for anyone who may be unaware, so the city of Atlanta is rewriting its zoning code. So this has been about 6 to 7, or I guess 5 or 6 years officially, and it's been planned for long after that. But this is our kind of first full-scale zoning rewrite since I think the 1980s, and so it's definitely been a big undertaking. And we're kind of in the final stretch now, so they're looking to be implementing coming this spring. So before we kind of talk about the changes, I just want to go over kind of what is the current situation in Atlanta regarding our parking policy. Um, so right now, there's actually a lot of Atlanta that already does not require parking. And so these kind of been changes that kind of in the last 10 or like 8 or so years that have been definitely positive. So right now, you do not have to provide any parking if you are within half a mile from a high capacity transit station. So right now, that just means all of the heavy rail MARTA stations, but this will be in the future for any kind of bus rapid transit or MARTA expansion. You also don't require parking for residential if you're within the Beltline overlay, which is about approximately a half mile on either side of the Beltline. And then lastly, also structures before 1965 do not require parking. So that's kind of a really important bit for if anyone wants to renovate a historic structure. They didn't have parking requirements before then, so often those sites don't have the land available to provide parking unless you would want to demolish some other historic structures of that kind of situation. So kind of what we've seen here is it's definitely been pretty successful and probably the most critical land doesn't have those requirements. And I guess as people living here, I think that all hell has not broken loose. It's been pretty successful. But so outside of these zones, so in the rest of the city, kind of abridged. So forgive me for compressing some of this. I didn't want to necessarily read an entire spreadsheet of every single kind of use, but the sparkness of it is basically within For residential uses, so R1 through R3, so these are our lower density zones. So think like Buckhead, think like Greenbrier area. So it's generally two spaces per dwelling. For our denser neighborhoods or denser single family, it's one space per dwelling. So like Mechanicsville, maybe like um, more of like midtown area. Within duplex zones, we currently have one space per dwelling plus one space per bedroom in excess of three bedrooms. So getting a little bit more complicated there. And then for multifamily, it ranges from kind of 2.2 to 0.42 spaces per dwelling, and kind of just to share a little bit of a visualization for multifamily. So it scales with density. So the denser or the more apartments that are allowed in a multifamily zone, the less parking per resident you get to provide. So it's kind of, I guess, 0.42 to 2. So we kind of run this whole gamut to kind of visualize kind of how much parking is required for a specific one. And so some important details is on-street parking can count towards your off-street requirements. So if you're a single-family house that has two spaces on the street, you're already satisfied, so you don't necessarily need that garage or driveway to provide that extra bit. Um, so this is our current state for residential. For commercial, kind of just going through. So maybe we can go down the list quickly. So we have a pretty high barrier for restaurants and specifically bars and restaurants that provide alcohol. So one space for 75 square feet. I'm going to bring back up this graphic that Tony provided earlier. So kind of looking on the bottom right here, that's one space for 100 square feet. So we're talking about per 75 square feet. It's way more parking than actual building provided. Um, what I've kind of heard from our Department of City Planning is a lot of that is due to kind of it's a way that the city has historically wanted to regulate, I guess, like nuisance uses of some neighborhoods don't want bars to come in. So the way that we prevent bars from coming is we require a crap ton of parking. Um, it's I guess a very indirect way, and I don't know how much we want to incentivize people driving to the bar, but that's the current state of things. So generally for retail, about 200 square feet, a little bit lighter requirements for offices, manufacturing, and then it kind of gets very complicated. Hotels, one space per room, plus a half space per employee, plus 300 per convention facility. Kind of, so I guess I don't need to go over all of these, but it gets a little bit. You get into the formulas, and then there's a much longer list, and some of these vary based on which zone you're in, based on kind of other conditions. So that's kind of the current state of things for outside. So what is being proposed under zoning 2.0? Um, so to start, so zoning 2.0 is eliminating most parking mandates in the city. So residential, it's definitely a very big change. So what we're looking at this map, so zone one, so it's kind of instead of well, so the Department City Plan is organized into three zones. So zone one is really kind of your core city, and then it also includes everywhere that's half a mile from a MARTA station. So this is mostly everywhere that already had zoning parking requirements removed already. I guess they kind of filled in with more some of the interior, but across the board, no parking requirements. Parking is fully repealed for all multifamily uses, all industrial, all offices, civic, religious, and educational uses, and most commercial uses. So this is really just giving choice back to the builders of they only have to plan for how much parking they actually need. You're not in a situation where you have to build twice as much parking um, as actually required. So there are some cases where we are still requiring parking. So in zone two, which is kind of like the periphery of the Beltline, so still kind of in town, but not quite kind of core city. So parking isn't required except for bars, lounges, and party houses. And there's a few more uses, but this is getting towards as I mentioned before, my understanding from city planning is that it's an attempt to regulate away certain uses. And then in zone three, there is parking requirements for single family and duplex homes. Again, for bars, lounges, and party houses, and then for kind of like larger restaurants and some other kind of like entertainment uses. Um, so another thing to mention, so even in these places that parking mandates are still required, they are being relaxed. So in single family duplexes, we're going from having 1 to 2 spaces per dwelling to just 1 space per dwelling. Although for restaurants, it's definitely being relaxed to where instead of 1 space per 100 square feet, 1 space per 400 square feet. So it's kind of I guess it's much lighter. And then bars and nightclubs and lounges are definitely being reduced as well. Um, so again, we're also keeping the kind of on-street parking requirements, or on-street can still count towards off-street. So we're not, especially from a housing perspective, it's not a huge concern. Most, I think, houses that are outside of this zone would be built with either already have on-street parking or they have a driveway or a garage. And then kind of the few commercial areas, definitely still a concern. Um, to kind of going along. So there are a few other changes within zoning 2.0. So we do now have parking maximums in zones 1 and 2. So there's a limit now. I know some zones already have this, but it's being kind of more broadened for kind of commercial uses. In residential. You can only build, or there's a limit to kind of prevent that is the case. And then another piece is the we're now or proposing that it will prohibit the demolition of buildings 50 years or older for conversion to surface parking. So if you want to demolish a historic structure, you have to at least provide some evidence that you're going to actually redevelop it, and that's just going to be surface lot. Um, so this is kind of and then one last thing. So there is an exception that is written in. So apparently Home Park is being written out to where all units have to provide 1 vehicle per bedroom. So I think of all of the exceptions, I think this is probably the most egregious, just because this is higher than what is required in kind of suburban single family homes. 1 per bedroom is a very high bar. And I think just on a matter of precedent of neighborhoods shouldn't be able to just exclude themselves from this kind of shouldn't just be able to decide of this if like if it's a good policy for the city, it should be for here too. And so especially it's going to have a big impact on kind of any future student housing for Georgia Tech and students who live in this area. So kind of that's the big changes here. So we're very excited for the changes within Zoning 2.0 around parking. I will just mention briefly at Abundant Housing Atlanta, we are a little bit disappointed though still in general Zoning 2.0. So just kind of before we get too far, this is definitely the most exciting piece of it, but kind of we really want to see within zoning 2.0, it's not making a lot of changes towards things like allowing more starter homes, enabling ADUs. It's making adding a lot of technical weight to things like administrative procedures. And so a lot of concern there. So yes, we're very excited for the parking portions of this. No, we're not extremely happy with zoning 2.0 as a whole, and so we're definitely wanting to see more changes before kind of this final thing is put through. Um, so that is all from me. So I think otherwise we can maybe kick it to questions for myself and Tony. So I know we do have some so right here. So I guess I know Carissa, so we have some questions that were given at registration, but I guess we can also go ahead and if anyone has any questions to pop in the chat, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you all for the really great discourse in the chat. And thank you, Tony and Anton, for giving us a really great foundation with your presentations. One question that's come through, actually, I'll start with this one from the registration since I think it's relatively potentially straightforward for Tony. What role do you see for parking maximums, if any?
Good question. I think that so PRN doesn't really focus. We don't Parking Front doesn't focus on parking maximum policy that much for a couple reasons. One, I mean, I wouldn't oppose them, right? Generally, I wouldn't testify against them, certainly. But in most places, I mean, actually, one thing we learned is that parking maximums are pretty common. They're in many, many, many cities big cities, small cities all around the country. They're almost always so high that they're ineffective. They're rarely really binding. And so there's a few places like Emeryville, California, and some other San Francisco where they are really high and they can either lead to negotiation, kind of that pretextual, the opposite of how the city currently uses the zoning to require affordability by requiring, more parking than they need. They can lead to some kind of more aligned conversations. Um, so, I think that we would the other issue is that one of the strongest arguments against parking requirements is that you can't know how much parking a development needs. That's something that's best left up to the people with the skin in the game that are renting or building the building. And so picking another arbitrary number is kind of undermines your strongest argument for eliminating parking requirements. You're saying this number, pick number, it's bad, and then you're like, oh, but I've got another number that's good, and it's very difficult to maintain a strong logical footing there. Instead, I think that there are alternatives to this that I think are useful. Certainly in certain areas around extremely, when the public has invested a lot in transit, for example, near main transit centers and things, I think you can argue you should not be allowing a very low land use, like a lot of parking right around a transit station. But ironically, transit systems often do that themselves. They want to build parking near the transit station. So, uh, um, I think impact fees and like recognizing that parking actually has negative impacts is a way to go. Where you say rather than Shoup used to say quantity over quality, like quality over quantity. Rather than saying you have a certain limit of parking spaces you can build, you say, well, if you're building parking, it has to be permeable surfaces. It has to have solar panels. It has to have all this good stuff that kind of makes it more expensive in general. That like a parking structure has to be convertible to another use in the future. And that's going to naturally reduce it. And ideally, if it's legal in your jurisdiction, you even say, look, there's a traffic impact fee for this parking. There's other fees that you can tack on to make it more expensive. So that's the long answer to a supposedly simple question, but it's tricky. I think it's great in a way, but the main thing is get rid of the ones that you have, and you're going to get rid of the mandates. That's more important than setting a maximum, probably in most places.
Great, thanks. All right, so I see a hand up. I see a couple chats. There was one question from before we went to Q&A, so I'm going to go to that one, and then Ruben, you're up next. So the next question, as someone who combs the municipal codes on a weekly basis, this is not me, I've noticed that many codes have parking mandates. Some city codes are more controlling and specific than others. When I went to the National Zoning Atlas seminar with Abundant Housing a couple months ago, thanks for joining us, they conveyed that the Atlanta Zoning 2.0 is making the code longer and lengthier in pages, but not necessarily more simple or more direct. So do you agree? This might be an Anton question, but feel free, either of you, to take this one.
Yeah, I guess I'll just give briefly. So I guess within the kind of the planning and the theorizing before zoning 2.0 kind of was fully delivered is very much like one of the promises was it will make zoning simpler. We're gonna take out all the fluff. We're gonna take out these like decades of technical debt of different interest groups have kind of put in over time. But kind of what we see with the current draft is we still have a lot of kind of very messy exceptions and new administrative procedures that are put in. So kind of generally, um, there's definitely some good things and there's some things that have been cleaned up very well. There's also a lot of new things that have been added that are kind of gonna gum up things as well. And so it's kind of I guess I don't know if I can necessarily say if it's worse or better in that regard specifically, but it just kind of like it is not meeting the moment of what we need to be able to provide housing at a scale that we require as a city to be able to kind of uh, work towards goals of affordability, of sustainability. Yeah, so that'll be my bit here.
I would agree with all that, and I just think it's easier to change your zoning code if it is simpler. I mean, I was trying to look at Atlanta's, and there's different like the hardest zoning codes to look at are ones that have entirely replaced, like, they have their own parking mandates and everything per zone, and it seems like yours is like that. And so, the stack of changes, the bigger that you're trying to do as a reform is often a red flag that will set people off more if there's more changes. So if your zoning code's simpler, you can probably reform it easier. But yeah.
Right. And next up, we have Ruben. If you want to speak up and voice your question.
Sure. Tony and Anton, thank you guys for your presentations. I have two questions, but you can pick which one to answer and then save the other question for the bookend, or for after everyone else gets to have their questions answered. Number one is just for Tony, what have what has been best practices for managing or for determining where to place meters? For cities that have repealed off-street mandates, because that's something that we're trying to advocate for in Houston, is getting rid of the off-street mandates. And a common question from the city council members is, okay, well then how do we figure out where to start metering, excluding where we've already metered? And then number two, it's kind of more of a silly one, but, or actually it's very serious. Why is it that parking is taxed so cheap? It's that's definitely part of the subsidies thing, is that why is that massive lots, as you guys have probably already seen through Urban 3, is that massive lots get taxed at a discount, meanwhile hardworking mom and pop shops compared to land value per acre get taxed so high.
I can hit a two for here with at least your first question and Griffin's question, kind of, which is that no one's really doing it right, or there are very few examples of it being done, of parking management being done very well. And part of that is that it's often too political. So the the I think the answer to your question is, I, to me, it seems a very logically data-driven, policy-driven decision. And of course, that's you know and it's idealistic, but the main thing is, if you're trying to decide how to manage your on-street parking, is to set a policy that is based on observation and some goals. What are your goals? I mean, some good goals, some example goals would be, we want people to who live in the neighborhood to be able to, find a parking space if they have a permit, right? In much of the country, you have permits that they sell 5,000 permits for 2,000 spaces. No one's happy. They're hunting licenses. So that's a goal. We want to actually have it work. We want to, we have a goal, we have a climate policy or some other transportation policy we want to support. So set that, and then set some performance parameters, and you use probably pricing to adjust that. So the key here would be, you add permit districts or zones when you once you start observing the type of occupancy that requires that. And I think one of the keys is, you don't have to start doing that from day one, but would be helpful in places that are considering upzoning would be to to say, we have a parking permit zone, or we're telling you, we're going to add permits here as soon as the density picks up, as soon as the development comes. We're going to implement this. We're not going to have a discussion after the fact. Far too often the fights happen after, like, the neighborhood's already full, and now we're going to talk about how to institute permits or meters, and you've already lost if you're coming in at that game. So getting ahead of the game with a policy citywide or whatever that does not require a vote. If your city council is voting on prices, it's not going to be you're not going to get the right price. So yeah, or voting on where the districts are.
So our next in line is from James, who says parking minima are used to regulate land use or reuse. If we eliminate these, what should we put in their place to regulate use?
Sarah, well, you had Sarah Bronin. Did Sarah Bronin give her talk when she talked to you guys? I mean, she has some chapters in Keys of the City around this, around how to restrict. There are other options that are like by the way, this is not uncommon. The idea that they use this, like Dallas, for example, parking requirements for bars were how they prevent bars from going into place. I think it you can do entertainment type districts. There are other forms of zoning or other policies that are not as arbitrary, that you can use to restrict nuisance zoning. I'm not an expert in those, but I think the real problem with parking mandates as this key is that it's a very arbitrary way to basically do corrupt spot zoning, right? Like if you can't build 5 bars in a row unless the city relaxes the parking requirements, like there's never parking is always like always an acceptable reason to reject something, in the minds of most of the country. So I think I would recommend checking Sarah's book. I don't have it on hand, but she mentions a couple examples like of areas that have used different types of entertainment zoning or entertainment or district type overlays to reduce or increase the amount of bars you might have, for example. But you might not be able to really say exactly, yeah, keys to the city. You might not really be able to say exactly where something goes. And I think some of how we build cities better is you have to give up some of that control in order to have choice and have abundant housing, and other abundant other stuff.
Well, I think that might allow us time for one more. And if I've got the list in order, lots of great comments coming in. The next question is, City of Atlanta has outsourced its on-street parking management to a private corporation and it does not enforce on Sundays even during major events. How does this compare to other cities? What are best practices?
Yeah, I was mentioning that. I mean, I think that once again, you
Oh,
shouldn't
yeah.
be too ashamed because most cities aren't doing things great on street. Outsourcing, I mean, I don't think they've done something similar as bad as like Chicago did, where it's like completely out of the city's control. Ultimately, it's a matter of the political will to say we want to provide access, we want to provide value. I think is a key thing in on-street management around this country is that it often does not provide value to the people using it. No one wins, right? The price is either too low or too high, and it's still hard to find a space, or you pay and it was super easy to find a space. So like why are you paying when there's no one on the block? So removing the politics from the management is I think the simple answer is set a policy and let your transportation department implement it rather than, you know, making it a political choice.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And I'll hand it back to Anton to close us out.
Yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to Tony. Just thank you everyone for being here. I guess special shout out, thank you, Council Member Mary Norwood, for being here. Really appreciate you. You will definitely be hearing from us at some point very soon. But yeah, again, so I guess if anyone has other further questions or something, I guess feel free to email us. When it has in Atlanta, you can email Tony, Parking Reform Network. I'm sure you can find their website with a quick Google search. But other than that, thank you everyone for being here and have a good night.